What do you do when your ex-husband brings his young mistress to your restaurant job just to mock you? Most would cry or scream. I simply smiled, bowed my head, and poured their wine. Why? Because the arrogant man leaving me a $20 tip had no idea that the lowly waitress serving him was actually the secret owner of this entire multi-million-dollar empire. Pull up a chair. The price of betrayal has never been this deliciously steep. Welcome to Zoe Revenge Stories, and thank you for being here today. My wonderful listeners, since YouTube has recently demonetized our channel and left us with zero budget, we kindly ask that if you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 via the PayPal QR code on your screen or the link in the description, so we can pay our hardworking staff to cover their living expenses and continue creating for you. Now, let me introduce you to Sarah Soto. I am Sarah Soto, 38 years old, and on this particular Saturday evening, I was blending perfectly into the background. The Obsidian Room, Portland, Oregon's most exclusive fusion restaurant, was a sensory overload of wealth and indulgence. It was a symphony of clinking crystal glasses, low jazz murmuring from hidden speakers, and the rich, intoxicating aroma of seared Wagyu beef and shaved white truffles. The dining room was an expansive canvas of plush velvet booths and dim amber lighting, meticulously designed to make the wealthy elite feel entirely insulated from the gritty reality of the streets outside. I wore the standard rustic linen apron over a crisp white button-down shirt, a stark, deliberate contrast to the designer gowns and bespoke Italian suits surrounding me. I was just another faceless server navigating the chaotic dinner rush, wiping down marble tables and balancing heavy silver trays. My face was a carefully constructed mask of polite subservience, completely hiding the cold, calculating stillness that governed my mind. The heavy cedar doors at the front entrance swung open, letting in a brief, sharp gust of the cool Oregon night air. That was the exact moment the steady rhythm of my evening shattered. Walking through those imposing doors was Mark, my ex-husband. He was 40 years old, a real estate investment director whose suffocating arrogance entered the room several seconds before his physical body did. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that undoubtedly cost more than my supposed annual salary as a waitress. Clinging tightly to his arm, practically dripping off his sleeve, was Chloe. She was 24, draped in an excess of oversized designer logos and blinding jewelry, holding her phone up high to record her glamorous entrance for her followers. She possessed the flashy, overly curated aesthetic of a mid-tier social media influencer, completely and utterly oblivious to the real world happening outside her camera frame. I stood near the waitstaff service station, gripping a folded linen napkin. Mark's cold, dry eyes swept lazily across the crowded, bustling dining room. It only took a few excruciating seconds for his gaze to lock directly onto mine. A slow, cruel, immensely satisfied smirk spread across his face. He did not look surprised at all. He looked entirely triumphant. He leaned over to Chloe, whispered something in her ear that made her let out a high-pitched giggle, and then strode directly toward the polished mahogany host stand. I watched from afar as he smoothly pulled out his silver money clip, casually sliding a crisp $100 bill across the podium to the hostess. He leaned in, pointing explicitly and deliberately toward the elevated VIP section in the corner, my section. He was literally paying extra just to ensure I would be the exact person forced to serve them for the next 2 hours. As the young hostess nodded enthusiastically and grabbed a pair of menus, a heavy, familiar chill washed over me. I stood perfectly still, letting the bitter memory of exactly 1 month ago play in my mind. The ink on our divorce papers had barely dried. After a decade of marriage, Mark had methodically, legally, and ruthlessly drained our joint accounts. He had hidden the vast majority of our funds in offshore shell companies and high-risk venture capital schemes entirely under his own name. He had tossed me out of our shared home with absolutely nothing, leaving me scrambling for shelter, or so he genuinely believed. He thought he had broken me down to a pathetic, destitute woman forced to wait tables and scrub plates just to survive the harsh winter. Most people in my position would have panicked. Any normal woman would have dropped her heavy tray, hidden in the cramped staff bathroom, cried uncontrollably, or begged a coworker to take the table immediately. I felt Diego, the head bartender and my only friend here, shooting me a deeply worried glance from across the polished brass bar. But I did not run. I did not hide. I took a slow, deep, stabilizing breath, letting the icy resolve settle deep into my bones. I smoothed the front of my coarse apron, erasing any invisible wrinkles. I picked up two heavy, genuine leather menus from the service station, walking with the graceful, measured, and unhurried steps of a seasoned professional. I approached their table. My posture was flawless. My expression was perfectly blank. "Good evening, and welcome to the Obsidian Room. My name is Sarah, and I will be taking care of you tonight," I said, offering them a warm, flawless customer service smile that did not reach my eyes. Mark did not even bother to look at the leather-bound menu I had just placed gently before him. He tossed the heavy binder onto the pristine white tablecloth with a dismissive thud that rattled the polished silver cutlery. His voice boomed across the intimate, softly lit dining space, deliberately calibrated to ensure the elegant elderly couple at the adjacent booth and the wealthy patrons across the wide aisle could hear every single arrogant syllable leaving his mouth. "We will start with the white truffle risotto," Mark announced, leaning back aggressively into the plush velvet booth and crossing his arms tightly over his tailored chest. "And do not skimp on the shavings. I want the extra ounce. Then, bring us 2 orders of the A5 Wagyu ribeye. Cook it rare. If it is a single second over rare, I will send it right back to the kitchen and ensure you pay for it out of your meager tips. Oh, and bring a bottle of the Chateau Margaux, the 2015 vintage." He turned his head to look at Chloe, puffing his chest out in a primal, pathetic display of dominance. "Only the absolute best for my girl," he declared loudly, flashing a brilliant, expensive smile that I had completely paid for with my comprehensive dental insurance 5 years ago. As I reached across the wide table to quietly collect the discarded menus, Mark intentionally leaned his upper body forward. The heavy scent of his expensive, overpowering designer cologne mixed violently with the stale, familiar stench of his deeply rooted narcissism. His voice dropped to a harsh, jagged whisper. It was intended only for my ears, yet projected with just enough forceful breath to ensure the verbal venom struck deep into my chest. "Look at you," he hissed, his cold eyes slowly and critically raking up and down my coarse linen uniform apron and my sensible, non-slip black work shoes. "Waiting tables at this age? How utterly pathetic. You really should have learned how to keep money instead of being such a lazy, useless wife. Maybe then you would not be scrubbing dirty plates and bowing to your betters just to make minimum wage." I kept my facial expression entirely neutral, locking my jaw tight. I did not flinch under his cruel gaze. I did not blink rapidly to fight back any tears, because there were absolutely no tears to fight. I merely nodded, offering a crisp, mechanical acknowledgement of his demanding order, and turned smoothly on my heel to walk toward the digital ordering terminal at the service station. When I returned 10 minutes later, carrying the $3,000 bottle of vintage wine, Chloe decided it was her explicit turn to assert dominance over the lowly, defeated ex-wife. She watched with a critical, haughty glare through her thick, artificial eyelashes as I presented the dusty bottle, uncorked it with practiced, silent precision, and poured a small tasting amount into Mark's large glass. He tasted it, swirled it arrogantly, and gave a tiny, dismissive flick of his wrist to approve it. I moved quietly around the table to pour Chloe's glass. Before the ruby liquid even had a chance to settle at the bottom of the crystal bowl, she dramatically shoved the delicate glassware away from her. The heavy base scraped loudly and offensively against the smooth wood of the table, drawing glances from nearby diners. "Are you completely blind?" Chloe whined, her voice remarkably nasal, grating, and pitched to an irritatingly high frequency. "There is a massive smudge right on the rim. I am absolutely not drinking out of a dirty, contaminated glass. Do you want me to catch a horrible disease from this place?" The crystal glass was immaculate. It had been polished twice with a microfiber cloth before the dinner service even began, but I simply apologized in a smooth, frictionless, and emotionless tone. I picked up the supposedly offending glass, placed it carefully on my heavy silver tray, and walked all the way across the expansive, crowded dining room to the bar to fetch a pristine replacement. When I returned and poured the expensive vintage anew, she picked it up by the stem, swirled it aggressively enough to spill a tiny drop on the white linen, took a minuscule sip, and violently puckered her glossed lips in exaggerated disgust. "This has not breathed nearly enough," she complained bitterly, loudly dropping the heavy glass back onto the table, nearly tipping it over. "You need to decant this immediately, and while you are at it, bring me a slice of lemon for my sparkling water. A fresh one, not one of those dried-out, pathetic wedges from the bottom of the plastic bin." I retrieved our finest crystal decanter from the back station. I carefully transferred the expensive wine, my hands perfectly steady and unbothered. I walked back into the sweltering kitchen, retrieved a pristine, brightly colored lemon slice on a small silver saucer, and navigated the complicated maze of occupied tables to bring it back to her. "Actually," Chloe sighed heavily, waving a manicured hand glittering with massive diamond rings that Mark had undoubtedly purchased using the hard assets he had legally drained from my personal accounts. "This slice is way too thick. It is completely disproportionate. I need a much thinner one. It completely ruins the aesthetic of my drink, and I need to take a picture for my followers right now." For the next 45 agonized minutes, she subjected me to a relentless, grueling, and methodical campaign of petty, agonizing torture. I walked back and forth from their VIP corner booth to the kitchen area no less than 24 times. She demanded an extra cloth napkin, then immediately claimed the starch in the napkin was too stiff against her delicate skin and demanded a softer one. She asked for a different steak knife, stating the weight of the silver handle was unbalanced and hurting her weak wrist. She requested a tiny side of warm truffle butter, only to send it back 3 minutes later because she claimed it had cooled down too much to melt properly over her expensive beef. Every single ridiculous demand, every haughty complaint, and every exaggerated sigh was a deeply calculated attempt to break my spirit. They desperately wanted to watch me shatter under the crushing weight of my supposed humiliation, right there in the middle of a crowded, high-end restaurant on a Saturday night. From his isolated station behind the long, polished brass bar, Diego was watching the entire agonizing spectacle unfold. His strong jaw was clenched so tightly, I thought the bones might actually snap under the pressure. Diego was a towering, heavily tattooed man, deeply protective and fiercely loyal to the people he cared about. We had spent the last several weeks working late closing shifts together, and he knew just enough about my recent, catastrophic divorce to understand exactly who the arrogant man sitting at table 4 was. As Chloe loudly sent me back for the 4th time to replace a supposedly dull cutting knife, I saw Diego violently throw his heavy stainless steel mixing tin into the washing sink with a loud, aggressive clatter that echoed over the smooth jazz music. He wiped his large hands furiously on his damp bar towel, his dark eyes blazing with unchecked, righteous fury. He took a heavy, incredibly determined step out from behind the safety of the mahogany bar. His massive shoulders tense and raised, he clearly intended to march directly over to their VIP booth, slam his heavy hands onto their pristine table, and physically throw them both out into the cold street for disrespecting me. I caught his eye immediately, across the chaotic, bustling, and noisy restaurant floor. I locked onto his furious gaze. I subtly shook my head, just once. It was a firm, absolute, and commanding silent order. I narrowed my eyes slightly, pouring every single ounce of my hidden, immense authority into that one fleeting look. Diego froze dead in his tracks. He understood power when he saw it. He did not know my ultimate secret. He did not know the shocking truth about the restaurant's ownership, but he easily recognized the terrifying, absolute calm radiating from my strict posture. He slowly backed away, retreating behind the bar, his massive fists still clenched tightly at his sides, reluctantly resigning himself to watch the agonizing, slow-motion performance continue without his interference. Finally, after clearing away their empty main course plates and enduring yet another exhausting barrage of insulting critiques regarding the texture of the Wagyu fat, I managed to secure a brief, glorious 2-minute window to step away from the dining floor. I pushed my way through the heavy, brass-plated swinging doors leading into the chaotic, steaming, and deafening kitchen. I wove quickly past the shouting line cooks, the roaring open flames, and the deafening clatter of copper pans, slipping quietly into the cramped, windowless, and sterile staff break room at the very back of the building. The air in this tiny room was stale, smelling faintly of harsh bleach and cheap, burnt coffee. It was utterly, beautifully silent compared to the overwhelming sensory explosion of the main dining room. If Mark had his way, if his pathetic, narcissistic fantasy were actually true, this would be the exact moment I collapsed against the cold, gray cinder block wall. This would be the precise moment I buried my tired face in my trembling hands and sobbed uncontrollably at the tragic, insurmountable misery of my utterly ruined life. Instead, I walked calmly and purposefully to the row of battered gray metal lockers lining the back wall. I did not shed a single, solitary tear. My breathing was perfectly even. My heart rate was as steady and rhythmic as a mechanical metronome. I spun the combination dial on locker number 7, pulled open the squeaky, dented metal door, and reached deep into my modest, worn canvas tote bag. I pulled out my personal, heavily secured smartphone. The bright screen illuminated my calm, unsmiling face in the dim, flickering fluorescent light of the break room. I bypassed the standard applications and opened a highly secure, heavily encrypted private messaging portal hidden deep within the phone's intricate folders. I scrolled past a dozen high-level financial contacts and selected a specific name simply listed as a single, unassuming punctuation mark. With rapid, precise, and entirely unhesitating keystrokes, I typed out a single, definitive, and fatal sentence. I did not pause to think. I did not second-guess my actions for a fraction of a millisecond. I hit the send button, watching the tiny status icon turn green, confirming the digital order had successfully vanished into the encrypted ether, destined directly for the device of my lead asset manager across the city. It is time to reel in the net. I slipped my phone back into the dark canvas bag, closed the battered locker door securely, and smoothed the coarse linen front of my apron one last time. When I pushed back through the heavy brass doors onto the main floor, the dinner rush had reached its absolute chaotic peak. Yet, over the harmonious clatter of heavy silver and fine crystal, Mark's booming, arrogant voice easily cut through the ambient noise like a jagged, rusty blade. I approached table 4 with a pristine silver tray to clear their half-eaten dessert plates. Mark was leaning entirely forward, his elbows planted firmly on the immaculate white linen, completely ignoring the basic, unspoken etiquette of fine dining. He was technically speaking to Chloe, but his immense volume was deliberately projecting to an invisible audience of wealthy strangers, deeply invested in his own fabricated, delusional grandeur. "It is a truly monumental acquisition, babe," Mark declared loudly, swirling the last ruby drops of his $3,000 vintage wine. "My investment firm is finalizing a massive, multi-billion-dollar buyout with the elusive, highly secretive holding group that owns this entire restaurant chain and dozens of others. We are talking about an elite hospitality portfolio that spans 3 different continents. By this exact time next week, the ink on the master contracts will be entirely dry, and the executive commission alone will propel my personal net worth into the absolute stratosphere. I will be a legitimate, untouchable multimillionaire. I mean, real, boundless liquid wealth. Not that highly restricted, petty cash I had to deal with in my previous, miserable life." He shot a deliberate, venomous glance directly in my direction as I reached out my right hand to carefully remove Chloe's empty porcelain plate. Chloe gasped loudly, her eyes widening in exaggerated, theatrical awe as she leaned her sharp chin on her manicured hands. "Oh my God, baby, that is absolutely incredible. So, we practically own this entire place already." "Exactly," Mark replied smoothly, puffing out his tailored chest and gesturing expansively around the opulent, dimly lit dining room. "In fact, I only brought you here tonight to conduct a little preliminary scouting. I need to personally survey the assets I'm about to take over. And let me tell you, there are definitely going to be some immediate, sweeping personnel changes once my firm assumes total operational control of the hospitality division." He snapped his fingers directly at my face, a sharp, incredibly demeaning sound that made my jaw lock tightly. "Check. Right now. We are completely done here." I nodded mutely, retrieved the black leather presenter from the digital service station, and placed it gently next to his right hand. The total for their extravagant, highly wasteful meal was exactly $3,426.50. Mark barely even glanced at the itemized receipt. He pulled a sleek, heavy black titanium credit card from his designer leather wallet and slapped it aggressively onto the folder. Then, with a slow, exaggerated flourish deliberately designed to maximize the intended humiliation, he reached into his front pocket and pulled out a single, crumpled green bill. He smoothed it out slowly with his thumbs, tore the customer copy of the receipt forcefully from the metal clipboard, and placed the $20 bill on top of it. He slid the pathetic, mocking tip directly across the smooth table until it rested exactly 1 inch from my fingers. "Take it," Mark sneered, his lips curling into a vicious, triumphant smile that exposed his white teeth. "Consider it a highly generous charitable donation to cover your pathetic daily living expenses. Use it to buy a warmer winter coat, or maybe some cheap instant noodles. Because the very second my legal acquisition of this management group is finalized next week, the absolute first thing I'm going to do is have the general manager march out here and fire you. I want you permanently blacklisted from every single fine dining establishment on the entire West Coast." I looked down calmly at the crumpled $20 bill. I did not reach for it. I did not flush red with sudden anger. I did not offer the fearful, defeated, and tearful reaction he was so desperately, hungrily craving. Instead, I let a profound, almost terrifying heavy silence stretch out between us. The ambient noise of the busy restaurant seemed to fade away entirely, leaving only the sharp, electric tension hovering thickly over table 4. When I finally spoke, my voice was incredibly soft, perfectly modulated, and entirely devoid of any emotional waver. "That is a remarkably ambitious timeline for such a complex, leveraged buyout." "Mark," I said casually, keeping my hands neatly folded in front of my coarse apron, "but I am rather curious about one specific detail. How exactly is your firm planning to circumvent the restrictive mezzanine debt covenants structured within the holding group's current portfolio? Considering your primary lending partner just reported a massive liquidity deficit last quarter, the tangible collateral you are offering on the commercial real estate side would fall short by at least 40% under standard institutional stress testing. Surely the holding group's executive board would immediately recognize that massive funding gap and flag your entire proposal as highly insolvent and fraudulent." For 3 agonizingly long seconds, Mark completely froze. The arrogant, triumphant smirk instantly vanished from his flushed face as if it had been violently wiped away. His mouth hung open slightly, his heavy brow furrowing in profound, paralyzing confusion. His cold eyes darted nervously, struggling intensely to process the highly specialized, ruthless financial terminology that had just effortlessly rolled off the tongue of the lowly waitress standing before him. He looked exactly like a confident man who had aggressively stepped onto solid ground only to find himself plunging unexpectedly into an icy, bottomless lake. He clearly recognized the exact financial roadblocks I had just described, because they were the precise, fatal flaws deeply buried within his fraudulent business proposal. Beside him, Chloe looked back and forth between us rapidly, her heavily glossed lips parted in blank, utter confusion, entirely unable to comprehend a single word of the sophisticated corporate jargon. The sheer, naked shock on Mark's face was a beautiful, fleeting masterpiece. But his deeply ingrained, toxic narcissism was far too powerful and fragile to allow him to remain stunned for very long. His face quickly flushed a deep, angry, mottled crimson as defensive. Explosive fury quickly replaced his initial moment of sheer panic. He slammed his heavy fist down hard onto the table, making the empty crystal glasses rattle violently against the wood. "Shut your damn mouth," Mark hissed aggressively, his deep voice trembling with a potent, ugly mixture of raw rage and deep-seated insecurity. "Do not try to stand there and use big words you clearly overheard from actual wealthy patrons just to sound intelligent. You have absolutely no idea how high-level corporate finance works. Sarah, you are nothing but a glorified servant fetching my water. Do not ever try to pretend you understand the harsh realities of the upper-class business world. Just take your pathetic $20, run my heavy credit card, and get out of my sight before I call the manager over here and have you thrown out into the dirty street tonight." I offered him a final, perfectly serene smile, entirely unbothered by his pathetic, venomous outburst. I gracefully picked up the leather folder containing his black titanium card. "Right away, sir," I whispered politely, my voice dripping with an icy, invisible promise of impending doom. I turned away from table 4, gripping the black leather folder tight, but before I could take a single step toward the payment terminal, the heavy cedar front doors did not just open, they were forcefully thrust apart. The sudden, aggressive movement sent a sharp gust of cold wind sweeping through the grand foyer, instantly drawing the attention of half the dining room. Walking through the entrance was Julian. He was the legendary, utterly ruthless chief executive officer of the sprawling hospitality conglomerate that ostensibly managed the Obsidian Room. Julian was a tall, imposing figure with silver hair flawlessly swept back, wearing a bespoke midnight blue suit that practically radiated intimidating, unapproachable corporate power. His sharp, predatory eyes scanned the elegant room with a stern, deeply serious expression. Clasped tightly in his right hand was a highly secure, heavily encrypted titanium tablet. Behind me, I heard the sudden, chaotic screech of heavy wooden chair legs scraping violently against the hardwood floor. I did not even need to turn around to know exactly what had just happened. Mark had bolted upright. His sudden movement was so frantic and uncoordinated that he nearly knocked over the crystal decanter of vintage wine sitting on the white tablecloth. He immediately recognized Julian. Of course he did. Julian was the absolute apex predator of the commercial real estate world, the exact man Mark had been desperately, humiliatingly stalking for the past 6 months, begging receptionists and junior associates for a mere 5-minute introductory meeting to save his drowning firm from total ruin. Completely abandoning Chloe, who sat frozen in the velvet booth with a piece of expensive beef hovering inches from her heavily glossed lips. Mark scrambled out of his seat. He aggressively smoothed down the lapels of his charcoal jacket, wiped his suddenly sweating palms on his expensive trousers, and practically sprinted down the wide, dimly lit aisle to intercept the newcomer. Mark forcefully inserted himself directly into Julian's path, blocking the CEO right in the middle of the crowded main thoroughfare. He thrust his right hand forward with a desperate, overly eager enthusiasm that bordered on pathetic groveling. "Julian Mr. Vance." "What an absolute honor," Mark exclaimed, his booming voice suddenly adopting a sickeningly sweet, obsequious tone that made my stomach churn. "I am Mark from the Capital Investment Group. We have been sending those preliminary term sheets over to your executive team regarding the multi-billion-dollar hospitality buyout. I just wanted to personally introduce myself and tell you how incredibly thrilled my entire board is to finalize this historic partnership with your visionary conglomerate." Mark stood there, his hand extended, an artificial, desperate smile plastered across his flushed face, waiting anxiously for the powerful executive to validate his existence. Julian stopped. He did not blink. He did not shift his posture. He slowly lowered his icy gaze to look at Mark's aggressively outstretched hand. Staring at it for 3 long, agonizing seconds as if it were a piece of rotting garbage that had somehow blown into his pristine establishment. Julian's expression remained perfectly blank, completely devoid of even a microscopic trace of professional courtesy or basic human recognition. He did not say a single word. He simply lifted his strong chin, shifted his broad shoulders slightly to the left, and stepped deliberately around Mark, completely ignoring him as if he were nothing more than an invisible, meaningless speck of dust on the mahogany floorboards. Mark's hand hovered uselessly in the empty air. His fake smile rigidly froze. The entire atmosphere of the bustling restaurant seemed to plunge into a sudden, breathless vacuum. The clinking of silver forks against porcelain plates stopped. The low murmur of wealthy patrons died away into absolute silence. Even the soft jazz music seemed to fade into a hollow echo. Every single pair of eyes in the immediate vicinity was now glued to the unfolding spectacle. Julian strode forward with commanding, rhythmic steps, leaving the stunned, humiliated real estate director completely paralyzed in the center aisle. Julian bypassed the polished brass bar, bypassed the bustling host stand, and marched directly toward the waitstaff service station. He was marching directly toward me. I stood perfectly still under the warm amber lights. I calmly reached for a folded, pristine white linen cloth and began methodically wiping the faint traces of moisture from my hands. I did not break eye contact as the powerful, intimidating chief executive officer approached his final target. When Julian was exactly 3 feet away from me, he stopped abruptly. The entire room collectively held its breath. Julian, a man who commanded thousands of employees and dictated the fate of billion-dollar enterprises across 3 continents, planted his feet firmly together. He lowered his head, bending his upper body into a deep, incredibly respectful, and highly formal bow. He held the secure titanium tablet out toward me with both hands, offering it with absolute reverence. When he finally spoke, his deep, resonant voice boomed across the deadly silent dining room, carrying a heavy, undeniable authority that shattered the quiet air. "Madam Chairman," Julian announced, his words ringing out with absolute clarity for everyone to hear. "The comprehensive financial due diligence report on Mark's corporate entity is fully complete and ready for your final ruling. Their entire portfolio is a fraudulent shell. We can destroy them tonight." Mark remained entirely rooted to the polished hardwood floor. The aggressive, mottled crimson flush that had dominated his face just moments ago rapidly drained away, leaving behind a sickly, translucent pallor. He looked like a man who had just been forcefully injected with ice water. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, functioning like a dying fish gasping for oxygen in the suffocating silence of the opulent dining room. He desperately looked from Julian's bowed head to my perfectly composed face, his mind violently rejecting the impossible reality unfolding before him. He raised a shaking hand, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest. "What is this?" Mark finally stammered, his booming voice reduced to a pathetic, vibrating croak that barely carried over the quiet jazz music. "Is this some kind of ridiculous, elaborate prank, Julian? Sir, did she put you up to this? Did my psychotic, vindictive ex-wife literally pay some actor to stage this pathetic theater production just to embarrass me in front of my new girlfriend? Because if she did, I am going to sue this entire establishment into the ground. I will have your corporate liquor license revoked by tomorrow morning." Julian slowly straightened his tall, imposing posture. He turned his broad shoulders slightly, fixing Mark with a stare so intensely cold it could have frozen a raging river. "You have absolutely no legal standing to sue the very corporate entity you are actively attempting to defraud." "Mark," Julian stated, his voice a lethal, vibrating baritone that resonated heavily through the quiet room. "And I strongly advise you to watch your tone when addressing the sole proprietor of this massive conglomerate. Sarasota has never been the useless, lazy burden you so loudly and publicly claimed she was. When this elite hospitality group was on the brink of total bankruptcy exactly 8 months ago, suffocating under terrible management, it was her private venture capital fund that swooped in and executed a complete, aggressive, hostile buyout. Julian took a slow, highly intimidating step toward the trembling real estate director, forcing Mark to instinctively recoil. She never needed your pathetic allowance while you were blindly chasing risky, foolish commercial real estate ventures, hiding joint assets, and loudly mocking her private, quiet investments at home. She was silently amassing an absolute fortune. The massive capital she utilized to build this empire came entirely from her personal, legally protected asset portfolios. Those early cryptocurrency investments and strategic tech stock options she acquired 5 years before she ever made the catastrophic mistake of marrying you, the ones you called a foolish, childish gamble. They yielded returns you could not possibly comprehend in 10 lifetimes. She is the undercover mastermind of this entire operation. She chose to put on that coarse apron and work the dining floor personally to evaluate the structural integrity and service quality of her own staff. While you were busy playing pretend, I calmly accepted the heavy titanium tablet from Julian's outstretched hands. The cool, solid metal felt wonderfully grounding against my palms. I tapped the highly secure screen once, bypassing the biometric lock, and brought up the finalized, heavily encrypted due diligence report my lead asset manager had just finished compiling. I gracefully stepped out from behind the waitstaff service station, my sensible black work shoes making soft, authoritative taps against the hardwood floorboards as I closed the physical distance between myself and my terrified ex-husband. Let us take a very close, public look at this magnificent, multi-billion-dollar portfolio of yours. Mark, I said, my voice echoing clearly across the hushed restaurant. I swiped my index finger slowly across the glowing screen, my eyes scanning the damning columns of red text. Ah, yes, here we are. Let us start with your flagship commercial property development in downtown Seattle. You confidently claimed it was 95% leased with premium corporate tenants. However, my forensic accountants spent the last 48 hours digging deep. They discovered that 80% of those leases are actually dummy contracts signed by hollow shell corporations that you personally registered in Delaware last year. They generate exactly $0 in actual revenue. It is a complete ghost town made of glass and steel. Mark took a stumbling, uncoordinated step backward, his chest heaving erratically as if he were having a severe panic attack right in the middle of the aisle. I did not stop. I swiped the screen again, my tone remaining as polite and conversational as if I were reciting the evening dinner specials. Then there is the highly concerning matter of your primary liquidity, I continued, pacing slowly in a tight circle around him like a predator examining a wounded prey. You boldly projected an incoming cash flow of $45 million by the end of the third fiscal quarter to secure our partnership. But according to the hidden banking ledgers my team legally accessed through our mandatory audit clause, your firm is currently drowning in over $62 million of high-interest mezzanine debt. You have completely defaulted on 3 consecutive loan payments. Your primary lenders are actively preparing to seize your remaining liquid assets in exactly 5 days. You did not come to my company offering a historic, mutually beneficial partnership. You came here begging for a desperate, highly fraudulent bailout to save yourself from federal prison. A sharp, dramatic gasp pierced the heavy silence. I briefly shifted my gaze past Mark's crumbling figure to look at the VIP booth. Chloe had pushed herself flat against the plush velvet backrest, staring at the man she thought was her golden ticket with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Her frantic movements had caused her heavy crystal wine glass to tip over entirely, spilling a dark, ruby-red puddle of $3,000 vintage wine across the pristine white linen tablecloth. The red liquid dripped slowly onto her expensive designer shoes, but she did not even seem to notice. The glamorous, carefully curated illusion she had so desperately bought into was violently disintegrating right before her heavily lashed eyes. The arrogant, untouchable titan of industry who had promised to fund her extravagant lifestyle, buy her imported sports cars, and elevate her social media status was nothing more than a desperate, broke con artist living on borrowed time and stolen credit lines. Her jaw hung completely slack as she processed the terrifying reality that the massive diamond rings weighing down her fingers were totally worthless, likely purchased with stolen funds, and were going to be repossessed by angry, aggressive creditors before the weekend was over. The atmosphere inside the obsidian room had undergone a catastrophic, irreversible shift. The earlier pleasant murmurs of polite conversation had been completely replaced by a crushing, suffocating silence. Dozens of highly influential, extraordinarily wealthy patrons, the exact elite society Mark had so desperately tried to impress, mimic, and infiltrate, were now staring directly at him, but their eyes did not hold a single ounce of the envy, respect, or admiration he constantly craved like a potent drug. Instead, their cold stares were filled with profound, icy contempt. They were looking at him the exact way one might look at a diseased, desperate rat that had somehow crawled out of the sewer and onto a crystal dining table. The elderly billionaire couple at the adjacent table shook their heads in slow disgust. The collective weight of their absolute, public shaming pressed down heavily onto Mark's shoulders, physically shrinking his once imposing posture until he looked incredibly small and fragile. He was entirely exposed, stripped bare of his expensive tailored suit and his loud, arrogant bravado. Standing totally helpless in the direct center of the magnificent empire he had foolishly tried to steal from the very woman he had thoughtlessly thrown away. I slowly retrieved the sleek titanium stylus tucked securely into the side of the heavy tablet case. I did not break eye contact with Mark. His chest was heaving erratically beneath his expensive charcoal suit, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I offered him one final, genuinely peaceful smile. It was a smile completely devoid of malice, yet heavier than a falling anvil. Holding the glowing screen so he could clearly see the final page of the executive summary, I pressed the fine tip of the stylus against the glass, with smooth, highly deliberate, and mercilessly precise strokes. I typed 2 absolute commands across his master acquisition document, rejected, and file lawsuit. I tapped the final execution icon. In that single, silent digital heartbeat, Mark's entire professional existence, his fabricated wealth, and his desperately constructed social standing were completely and utterly eradicated. But I was not finished. The trap I had so carefully set was designed to close from every possible angle, leaving absolutely no room for escape. Furthermore, I announced, my voice cutting cleanly through the absolute, heavy silence of the dining room, my corporate legal team did not merely draft a rejection letter tonight. Exactly 45 minutes ago, while you were loudly complaining about the temperature of your truffle butter and mocking my waitressing uniform, they formally submitted the entire, unredacted portfolio of your forged tax documents, phantom lease agreements, and rampant wire fraud to both the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. I imagine federal agents are actively securing the glass doors of your corporate headquarters at this very second, placing heavy padlocks on your fabricated kingdom. A sharp, violent scrape of wood against hardwood forcefully shattered the tension. Chloe had shot up from the plush velvet booth as if the cushion beneath her had suddenly caught fire. Her heavily contoured face, previously frozen in pure, unadulterated shock, was now violently twisted into a mask of pure, self-preserving fury. She realized instantly that the arrogant titan of industry she had been clinging to was no longer her golden ticket to high society. He was a massive, rapidly sinking anchor bound straight for federal prison, and he was threatening to drag her down with him. She aggressively grabbed her heavy crystal glass of iced sparkling water from the table. With a sharp, furious flick of her wrist, she hurled the freezing contents directly into Mark's ashen face. "You absolute, pathetic, lying loser," Chloe shrieked, the icy water dripping pitifully down his nose and soaking into his ruined, tailored suit jacket. "You promised me the world, and you are literally nothing but a broke criminal. Do not ever speak to me or contact me again." She snatched her oversized designer handbag from the leather seat, nearly knocking over the empty wine bottle in her frantic haste. She stormed past him, her sharp high heels clicking aggressively against the floorboards as she marched straight out the grand cedar doors, disappearing into the cold night without a single, solitary backward glance. Mark's knees completely buckled under the immense, crushing gravity of his total annihilation. He collapsed heavily into the nearest empty chair, his wet face buried deeply in his trembling hands. The sheer weight of his complete, public humiliation pressed him down into the floor. Right on cue, the restaurant's general manager quietly stepped forward, placing the black leather folder containing the massive bill for $3,426.50 directly onto the table beside him. Mark did not even attempt to reach for his designer wallet, knowing perfectly well that every single credit line attached to his fraudulent name had just been permanently frozen by the authorities. I reached behind my neck and calmly untied the coarse knot of my rustic linen uniform. I let the heavy apron slide slowly off my shoulders, dropping it carelessly onto the polished floor. The removal of that simple cloth revealed the impeccably tailored, razor-sharp designer dress I'd been wearing underneath the entire time. I looked down at the broken, shivering man sitting completely paralyzed at table 4. "Julian," I said smoothly, my voice projecting authority, "please completely waive the check for this specific table. Consider it a supreme act of corporate charity for a destitute, broken man who clearly cannot afford a single slice of bread tonight." I turned my back on Mark forever and walked gracefully toward my own private, secluded booth, waiting at the far end of the room, leaving him to drown in the absolute ruin of his own making. 6 months later, the final, pathetic chapter of his life was permanently closed. Mark's investment firm officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, his stolen assets completely liquidated to pay back furious creditors. I sat quietly in my expansive, glass-walled office, sipping a cup of hot black coffee. I watched the glorious morning sun rise over the glittering city skyline, while the morning news played softly on the television in the background. The broadcast showed crystal-clear footage of Mark being escorted in heavy iron handcuffs up the granite steps of the federal courthouse, his head bowed in deep shame, facing decades behind bars. Looking out over the massive empire I had built with my own hands and intellect, a profound, unshakable sense of peace washed over me. I realized then that the absolute most perfect revenge is never found in screaming matches, thrown dishes, or bitter, consuming hatred. The ultimate, flawless trap is simply rising to become the absolute master of your own fate, standing silently at the very pinnacle of power, and calmly watching toxic, arrogant people entirely destroy themselves through their own boundless greed and breathtaking ignorance. Thank you so incredibly much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would absolutely love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from right now? Please let me know in the comments below. If you found today's journey compelling and wish to support our channel during this incredibly difficult time, we would be deeply, truly grateful for a donation of just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by clicking the secure link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Your generous support allows us to pay our dedicated staff, helps them feed their families, and ensures we can continue bringing you even more powerful, high-quality stories in the future. Thank you again from the bottom of my heart, and please take care.